All right. Thank you again, Suzette, Buzz, and Jack for the invitation to participate. This has been truly a phenomenal process and really shows Eric's global reach in his science and his friendship and his intellectual endeavors. And these are some pictures. I'll just put them up so you don't have to look at my sad face throughout the talk. But this is Parker's Pit. I'm not going to be talking about that today. I'm going to be talking about databases. But this is a cave that Eric's parents found, and eventually we worked 14 years together on it. And it shows Eric going down into the cave, which had been talked about earlier, George Jacobson and others. And then it shows Eric in the cave. And see if we can, I guess it's not going to move forward, but we had some other slides that showed Eric leading field trips and things like that. But my purpose today is to sort of talk about the early history of the North American Pollen Database and FunMap, and then eventually of Neotoma. And Eric came to the museum in 1986, as Bonnie Stiles had indicated. And I had met Eric in 1985 at a Plains conference, which is an archaeological meeting about prehistoric people of the Plains region in North America or the United States. And we spent one evening drinking beer and talking about bison and evolution of environments and vegetation on the Northern Plains. And what brought Eric to the Illinois State Museum, as Bonnie indicated, was a project known as the Superconducting Super Collider. And what this was, it turned out, unfortunately, to be a political boondoggle, is the United States wanted to take the lead in high particle physics. And so they were going to build this gigantic particle accelerator. And they were opening it up to states, and states had to make bids and submit their bids, and then the federal government would decide which state got the super collider. And of course, lots of money was involved in this. And one of the things that the states had to do was to develop a gigantic environmental impact statement, so it would be clear that if that state got the bid, there wasn't anything that was going to ball it up and cause the project to end. And the Illinois State Museum was involved with this, with the other surveys, the Water Survey, the Natural History Survey, and the Geological Survey in Illinois. And the museum's part was to do an archaeological survey and a paleobiological survey looking for fossil sites. I was coordinating the paleobiological survey. We were looking for primarily mammal sites, but any other type of quaternary sites that would be useful for providing paleoenvironmental information. And we discovered Nelson Lake, which has been discussed earlier as well. And I sent a crew up to Nelson Lake to take a preliminary core to see if there was any pollen in it. And they did, and came back, and Jim King, who was at the museum at that time, looked at it and said, yes, it's loaded with pollen. The problem was that Jim had advanced to head of the scientific section, so he really wasn't going to be able to work on it. So I talked Jim into saying, let's hire Eric. And so we ended up hiring Eric, and he and Jane and Maria moved to Springfield. And as Bonnie indicated, this started out as a soft money position. But then Eric came on to hard money and became the assistant curator of botany. But he was in a peculiar situation. He was a curator, but he didn't have any collections to curate. The herbarium was being curated by Al Coling, who was our botanist. And pollen slides, as everybody knows, deteriorate over time. So there was no sense of making collections of pollen slides. So Eric came up with the idea, why don't I curate data? And he realized that lots of palynologists were either passing away or retiring, and a lot of their data was just being thrown away, and you couldn't get to it, or it was in files and paper copies. It was a real mess. So he thought, well, why don't we start developing a computer database for this? And he initially started with the COMAP project, which was run by Tom Webb, where they looked at pollen sequences across the US to look at climate and major changes in climate. And so Eric got a hold of this data, and he was funded by NOAA, the Paleoclimate Data Center. And he hired a team, a man by the name of Steve Porter, who was a Canadian and who did data entry, and then John Keltner, who was a programmer. And John was married to Julianne Snyder, who was a preparator who worked for myself and Jeff Saunders. And John would come into the lab and he was enmeshed in computers and just program. And Eric saw him and decided he was the man. But the funny thing was with Steve Porter was a Canadian and he was a geographer. And so Eric hired him. He did an advertisement and hired Steve. He was a palynologist. And Steve loaded up his car and headed for the United States to take the job. But he made one slight mistake. He tried to cross in Browning, Montana. And Browning is a one-horse town. And probably very few people that the local custom agent knows everybody who goes across the border. Well, not only was this a stranger, but this guy was a guy looking for a green card. So this was really a major factor. And so he started to process it. And at that time, NAFTA had been passed, which is the North American Financial Trade Agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And one of the things in that agreement was that certain jobs were not available to people from other countries. And one of those areas happened to be geography. And so Steve tried to argue with the customs agent and tell him that, he was a palynologist. And of course, the guy had no idea what that was. So then he called Eric from the customs station in Montana. And Eric got on the phone and had a lengthy, and I'm sure heated discussion with the customs agent, as he came down to my office shortly after that. And I think everybody knows Eric's attitudes towards bureaucracy and politicians. And so after that, Steve went back, I think, to Calgary, where he was from. And about a month later, Eric was able to work it out. Steve came through Detroit, where he wouldn't be recognized so much as a problem. But anyway, they got together and developed the North American Pollen Database. And of course, the major theme of that database and all of our databases is to share data, make it available to everybody so anybody can use it. Well, originally, there was some initial skepticism about this from palynologists, particularly some of the older palynologists, and rightfully so. They had been developing this data. It was their data, and why should they give it up for other people to do research? And so Eric had used his typical Eric approach to this. Instead of me, who I'd be beating on my chest saying, I'm going to come and invade your lab and take your data if you don't give it to us, Eric said, fine, okay. And what happened, of course, then were papers began to be published, and the data that these people had weren't in the publications. And so they started calling Eric up and saying, why didn't they use my data? And Eric just said, your data is not in the database. You didn't give it to us. And the next day, the data arrived. So he was able to get beyond that. And as I indicated, the data was originally served by NOAA, and the database then expanded to the EPD, the African database, the Latin American database that we've heard about, and eventually became the Global Pollen Database. Well, at the same time that Eric was working on the NAPD, I had started working on a project called FunMap. And again, this relates back to sort of the superconducting super collider, because the museum had obtained a geographic information system. And what we were doing is making maps of the different hazards that could be cause impact of the super collider, and then we could overlay these maps. But I realized right away that this would be very useful, because then we could start tracking changes in the distribution of species through time. And this is something that I had been interested in since I was a graduate student with Ernie Lundelius at the University of Texas. So Ernie and I got together and developed the idea of developing a database. And we got an NSF grant. And one of the things about FunMap is that it is different in several ways from the North American Pollen Database. First, it's a research database, and that's what it was developed for. It's just a major research project where we're going to look at various ecological aspects of range shifters in mammalian species. And the second thing is it doesn't contain raw data. It contains data from the literature, which has already been summarized. but we had decided that that's what we wanted to do. And so we went forward with that. And Ray Druho, who was working on the SSC project in archaeology, became our programmer. So he began to set up the FunMap program. And Eric Schroeder, who was the GIS specialist for the SSC project, also helped us. And we then began to form the database. And of course, I was just about 2 doors down the hall from Eric, and I knew he was working on his North American Pollen database. So we chatted quite a bit about, what sorts of data do you collect? How do you collect them? What's the best format for that? And the FunMap database then evolved, and we served the data through the Illinois State Museum. And it was an interactive database with a GIS system, probably one of the first that developed. And so people could get on and create maps of range changes for different mammal species on the fly. And it became very popular, and people also began to use the database. We published the results of our scientific research in Science. And once that was published, we thought, why not share the data so people can use it? And that's when we did put it online. Like the North American Pollen database, it expanded, and that there were several other faunal databases that were developed on that model. The MyoMap, which Tony Barnowski developed for Miocene mapping of faunas in North America. The NeoMap project, again, which was a combination of MyoMap and FunMap for linking time periods. The Mexican quaternary mammal database was developed on the same type of structure with Joaquin Arroyo. The Paleofauna database of Western Europe and Eastern Russia was developed by Anastasia Markova. But unlike NAPD, these databases weren't coordinated. They shared the same type of structure, but they weren't identical. And so it was very difficult to work across these. And that was unfortunate, but that's the way it evolved. So then, probably early in the 2000s and sometime around 2006, Eric and I had been talking about why didn't we develop our databases together. We decided we wanted to do some research on, particularly in the Northern Plains, on vegetation and faunal responses to environmental changes. And so Eric began to look at the FunMap structure and the North American Pollen database structure. And because we'd been chatting all along, he noticed that the structure was pretty much identical, very similar. There were differences, and we handled data differently. But he indicated that it shouldn't be too hard to reprogram all of this and create a database where we could actually then begin to do paleoecosystem type of analyses. Again, our original thought was to look at vegetation and mammals. And we then started talking with Jack Williams about this. And Jack was a major database user. And Jack said, well, why don't we expand it to incorporate other disciplines? Steve Jackson at that time had developed a North American plant macrofossil database. Alan Ashworth was developing a coleoptera database. So we invited Steve and Alan to join us. And the 5 of us put together an NSF proposal that we sent in to develop the Neotoma database. And that was awarded, and we then met at Penn State, where I was at the time, and began to develop the structure of the database. And we worked with programmers there in the Center for Environmental Informatics, which was a group of programmers. I like to call it a stable of programmers, because they had programmers for all different types of languages, all kinds of uses. And it was all under one roof. And so we met with these people and then developed basically the structure for the Neotoma database. And since that time, I think everybody realizes that probably there are 20 now disciplinary types of databases that have become part of Neotoma. So it's expanded considerably at that time. And we held the first Neotoma workshop in Penn State. That's where the computer was at, and that's where all of our programmers were at. And probably the largest and the most contentious argument in this entire database was not about the data, was not about the structure of the data, but was about the name. that we were going to use for the database. And after about a half hour of, pretty emotional discussion, I said, enough is enough. We're moving on to another topic. We'll name the database later. So we went on, and we didn't have a name for our database, but we didn't worry about that. We worked out things and moved on. Well, Eric had driven up to Penn State from Illinois with Brandon Curry. And so Brandon and Eric were driving back to Illinois and discussing the workshop. And of course, one of the things came up about, well, the name. What could we call this database? And it was Brandon who suggested the name Neotoma. And for those who are not North American mammalogists, Neotoma is the scientific name for what's known as the pack rat. And what pack rats do is they go out and they collect objects, stems, leaves, fruits, pollen, soil, artifacts, bones, snails, and they put them in a big midden, which they actually live in. So the analogy was complete. Here we had something that was going out and collecting all of this potential paleo-environmental data and putting it in a database. So at the next meeting, Eric and Brandon suggested we call it Neotoma, and it passed unanimously. One of the other major differences between the FunMap database and the North American Pollen database is that Eric had developed a data input, and that was Tilia. And that was what John Keltner had worked on a great deal. And the great thing about Tilia is it allowed you to check the data as you input it into the database. And so it got rid of lots of errors, things like that. We did not do that with the FunMap database. We didn't have a programmer to develop that at the time. And we argued and published on this that, if there were errors in the database, they would show up. And if they looked like they were significant, then they should be checked. But if they were embedded in other data that, didn't make any real difference, then it probably wasn't that significant. But clearly, when we decided to do Neotoma, it was apparent that we needed to have some sort of a data checker, and Tilia became that. And Eric was the one who developed that and continued to develop that for all of the disciplines, and it's one of the major contributions. And so basically, that's the story of how Neotoma came about, and we'll hear more about it today. It has a phenomenal evolution. I left the database probably 6 years ago in retiring and passed it on, but still very much interested in it and seeing where it's going and what's happening. And it's really been a testament to Eric's legacy that it's used so much with so many publications. I know Jack will talk about this and what's been done with it. And I don't know if you can see, but Eric is sitting right behind me right now on my left shoulder, making sure that I'm telling the truth, because I am a vertebrate paleontologist, and you never really trusted vertebrate paleontologists. So I'll just close with one quick story about Nelson Lake, which was the lake that brought Eric to the Illinois State Museum, and Bonnie Stiles showed a slide of that. As I'd never been out coring, and so Eric asked me if I wanted to go out and core this lake. Of course, why not? And he said, well, it's going to be frozen and it's going to be cold, so we're going to go out there and spend a day on the ice coring. I'm like, okay, fine. So I show up at the museum and we're ready to go, and we go out to the lake and get to the lake, and I'm freezing. And I'm looking at Eric, who's nice and toasty, and Eric has on insulated rubber boots, Carhartt coveralls with probably 5 layers of clothing under them, a wool hat, gloves with rubber gloves. And I said, Eric, why didn't you tell me about this? He said, it should have been obvious. You're standing on a lake for an entire day. It's going to be cold, and you should dress appropriately. Dumb paleontologist. And then he took out his rig and drilled a hole in the ice and said, okay, this is our core hole, Russ. And I'm like, oh, okay, that looks pretty reasonable. And he walked about 6 feet away and he drilled another hole. And I said, what's this for, Eric? And he says, this is our beer hole. which point he dumped a 12-pack of beer into the hole, and they'd pop right up automatically as you extracted a beer. And he then handed me this ladle that had holes in it and said, Russ, you're the core hole, or the beer hole tender. Don't let it freeze. Keep it open. And so I had quit drinking at that time, and I had some diet sodas with me. And I thought, oh, that's kind of clever. So I dumped my diet sodas into the beer hole. And of course, they didn't have alcohol, so they didn't float. And they went directly to the bottom of the lake. And Eric just came over and shook his head and said, dumb vertebrate paleontologist. Eric, we really miss you. And Jane, Maria, and family, we wish you the best. He's a phenomenal person. Thanks.
Thank you, Russ. Always loved your stories, and today couldn't be complete without the story of how the name Neotoma came about. So thanks a lot for sharing that. I do have a comment by Jessica that she doesn't really agree with the characterization of the vertebrate paleofolks. But yeah, thanks for sharing this story.
Well, I don't agree with it either. I'm just reporting Eric's impression. But no, Eric, as we all know, and like I said, I spent 14 years with him excavating vertebrate fossils in a cave, appreciated all aspects of science and information that would lead us to learning something about the past world. So, I mean, again, that was one of his major attributes, is anything was fair. And I see Bruce McMillan there. I just sort of shout out to him. And he was very instrumental in developing this interdisciplinary team at the Illinois State Museum. Eric wasn't the only one that came there on soft money. I did, Jeff Saunders did, several others. And it was through Bruce's ability to find money that we all became permanent employees. And it really was a phenomenal place. And I hated leaving when I did, but it was just amazing. And Eric was a critical part of it.